Looking at the domestic situation in Russia, some saying why the crackdown on the part of the Kremlin. And with us to talk about it, Sasha KOULAEVA of the International Federation of Human Rights, joining us from Moscow. She's the president of the Institute of Democracy and Cooperation, a former member of the Duma, Natalia Narochnitskaya. Also with us here in the studio, historian Frederick Jewsbury, and France 24's Douglas Herbert. Douglas, there's another event going on in Moscow. We mentioned some of them at the top, and this one's kind of important. The posthumous trial, that is to say, the trial of a dead man going on. Sergei Magnitsky, he died in detention. He was a whistleblowing attorney back in 2009. Day 3 of hearings this Monday. Why is this case pressing on?
Sergei Magnitsky basically represented everything that right now the Kremlin, as it is, hates most. I mean, he was a whistleblower, and the thing is, he actually blew the whistle on corruption. This man, on hundreds of millions of dollars of corruption within the Russian government, and instead of going after the corruption and the source of it, or at least instead of investigating his allegations, what they did is they turned around and went after him. And we know the rest of the story. The rest of the story is tragic. He was found dead in his jail cell in 2009, and to this day there are disputed accounts of what actually happened. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the question with Magnitsky has basically become almost a lightning rod, if you will, or a beacon for critics of the government of all that is right now wrong with the current state of governance in Russia. And more specifically, he exemplified someone who stood up, tried to point the finger and say, j'accuse, this is wrong, and this is what happens to people who try to put a red card up to the state. He really is a lightning rod, and we're gonna show it. There's the case of a former KGB official who became an opposition politician, supported the Magnitsky Act, which was voted in the United States against those putting sanctions on those who went against Magnitsky in Russia. Opposition politician Gennady Gudkov, he got kicked out of the Duma. His security company got shut down. Now his 33-year-old son, who's also a member of parliament, is in trouble. Sergei Gudkov, one of only 7 Duma members to oppose that adoption ban, went to the U.S. at the start of last month. There he told a panel at a Washington think tank conference of his fact-finding on adoption of Russian babies. He said, "This weekend I visited several American families that adopted Russian children. I want to say I'm very grateful to them and other families for taking care of our children." Russia, which has responded to the Magnitsky Act by banning the adoption of Russian babies by Americans. Natalia Narochnitskaya, do you agree with that ban?
Yes, I can hear you. Well, I would like to comment on several things that I heard in this discussion. First, about the term agent. I don't like the term. I agree with you. I would prefer actor because of the reminiscences of old times. But in other aspects, I have nothing against this law.
But do you agree on the ban on banning Americans from adopting Russian babies?
It is too many cases from America, because there is no ban on any other adoption. In France, we have absolutely harmonious relations with regard to these complicated issues that requires the alienation and correspondence of different legal systems of countries. No, Italians adopt a lot of things. It's only from America that we constantly receive information about very strange cases, and that was the reason that the Duma adopted this law. And everybody, the opponents of this law say that we are deprived.
I'm sorry,
we have to be factual here. First of all, François. First of all, wait, but first of all, you'll recognize, you will agree that more Americans adopted Russian children than citizens of any other country. We are talking about thousands and thousands of adoptions. The cases you're talking about that you called strange, they are extremely, extremely rare. We're talking, you can count them on your hand. You could count them on your hand, and I think you would agree, because you followed the Russian press coverage, I am sure of this, they have been very much blown out of proportion. We never hear about the successful cases of orphaned Russian children being adopted by American families where they've grown up to live happy, successful lives. We hear about the very few cases of absolute tragedies, which I'll agree are tragedies, but that's all we hear about. And they have been blown up by the state-run Russian press for political effect a lot of the time, and it works, unfortunately.
Many countries in the press issues are used for some political blah blah etc. So it's no wonder. But in America, the case is that the American authorities, referring to the difference of responsibility of the federal state and the states in the United States, refused practically to fulfill and execute the agreements that we achieved before, because there are certain rules that we insisted on, that Russian country and is allowed to follow the destiny of a child for a certain period of time. And Americans very often refuse that information or disregard any request with this regard. And that is certainly the reason also that alarms us. And you say that thousands and thousands of Russian people, contrary to what people think abroad, adopt many times more children than Americans. Although I can believe, and I'm sure that there are very good American families who adopted Russian children and they are happy and they are wonderful parents, of course. And the worse to the United States that the policy of the country, of the authorities, throws.
All right, so we understand the difference here. George Frederick Jewsbury, all of this is born. This ban on adoption came after the Magnitsky Act. Mm-hmm. Why is the case of Sergei Magnitsky hit such a raw nerve?
I think Doug said it the best. Magnitsky represents everything that is, shall we say, verboten for the Kremlin right now. In fact, as a historian looking back, I think we're back in the age of Nicholas I. We're having an official nationalism put together, orthodoxy, autocracy, nationality, except it's Putinism, the church, and Russia. And then you go to the fact that you have this visceral anti-Westernism that was there at Nicholas I against industries, against railroads. All of a sudden, we have this reborn under Mr. Putin. And I'm sorry, I can't tell you why. Because the elections are done. The economy is not that bad a shape. In fact, there's the response to the shale gas. They found this huge the red linen deposit.
Made the front page of today's Financial Times. There's going to be all this untapped wealth.
It is something which I think maybe our colleague can tell us. But as an American watching Russia for a half century, I've never seen anything like this.
Sasha KOULAEVA, why are things coming to a head? And there'd been all this talk of hitting the reset button in the relations between Moscow and Washington. We've been told that the tough talk was, rhetoric on the campaign trail. But why is the Magnitsky case raising red flags? Why is all this happening now?
Well, I guess there are several explanations possible, and I'm not pretending to have all of them in hand. But, in Russia now, the Human Rights Society and activist Civil Rights Society are joking that our society is divided between pessimists and optimists. Pessimists think that things still can go worse, and optimists think that things are so bad that cannot be any worse any longer. I think that all these years, because Putin has been in power for many years now, he disappeared for a while from his presidential chair, but not from the political life, and he has never disappeared totally from the presidency of Russia. All these years, the direction was clearly going to more and more restrictions, more and more repressive measures, more and more closing windows of opportunities for the civil society, for the civic initiatives for any kind of exchanges of opinions, and we can see where the freedom of media is now, where the freedom of speech is now. The long list of human rights defenders and journalists disappeared, murdered, or imprisoned. And now we have once again a long list of political prisoners, which has not been the case for years already. So we had a feeling that there was this toughening of the regime, progressive toughening of the regime, and then when President came back to his chair, which he left, as we say, cosmetically for a while, now he's back on his place, and now he can permit himself something he was maybe willing to do for a while already.
And, you know, a lot of this boils down to the personality of Vladimir Putin himself. I remember last month, was in Moscow, François Hollande was visiting Putin, sitting there in the Kremlin, they're sitting next to each other. One of the journalists stands up, I think he was from one of our rival news organizations, and asks him, I watch you gentlemen together. I don't see much warmth between you in your body language. You look very stiff sitting there next to each other. And Vladimir Putin, he never smiles, but looks the man straight in the eyes, this journalist, and said, come a little closer and you'll feel the warmth. And it would normally I would have laughed. It would have been a funny comment. I did sort of laugh, but it was also a little chilling because there was the man right there. And you just felt it.
But as George Frederick Jewsbury says, the man is popular.
The man is popular, however, as we could also say, and maybe we're only talking about Moscow for now, but in certain segments of society, and yeah, a lot of the younger generation, there really are two Russian societies. Yes, Putin resonates with a large section of Russian society, a still very large section, and yes, a lot of it outside of Moscow, but within Moscow, which for better or for worse still is the forging ground for a lot of where Russia might be headed in the future, you have, and we haven't been talking at all about these people, a young new generation, 20s, 30-something. These people are either apolitical or they're on the streets demonstrating, a lot of them, and they're very open to the world. A lot of my friends who I see there, I mean, they spend their days going to cultural exhibits. The Moscow Fashion Week just ended. They spend their time there.
But is that just the happy few?
No, it is a very small elite. But, you know, they're going to photography exhibits. They're hungry for culture. They're hungry for openness. They're sick of the old way of thinking. They don't want revolution. They don't want revolution. That's old and that's old hat. What they do want is to change mentalities. They want to start changing things. They want people to think differently. And they already are starting it by thinking differently.
All right.
Yeah, and I think that something very important to mention is what kind of arguments is used by the power against the opposition, against NGOs, against human rights defenders or any independent journalists. We are always speaking about some stereotypes, negative stereotypes. We're trying to say that all these people are just getting money, lots of money from the West, which always works. When you say someone has much more money than you, it always works. Then there are all these also stereotypes about, for example, sexual minorities, which they take out of the old past, which we believe to be the old past, but which is coming back again with LGBT law, which forbids, in a way, any activity linked to the defense of sexual minorities' rights. Then they take out the story of babies, poor babies adopted by angry and bad American families. Nobody mentions that these babies who are adopted by American families are handicapped children. There is a law which forbids, in fact, adopting the good health children. So these are the children Russians do not want to adopt and who would have lots of health accidents or even deaths in the places where they are because no Russian family would take them. So what I wanted to underline is that a lot is done to use the stereotypes and some, you know, undermining thinking of people in a country which is not that much used of democracy.
All right, but Douglas Herbert making the argument that there is there's a generation gap between the young and the old. The last Soviet president, Mikhail Gorbachev, claims the genie's out of the bottle and there'll be no turning back to the old days.
We've now reached such a stage where we've interrupted perestroika. But there'll be no turning back. Even if President Putin and others think that they can return to those old methods of force and fear and control through fear.
Natalia Narochnitskaya, would you? What's your reaction to that point and to the one made by Douglas that there's sort of a generation gap between those who've been in power now for a long time in the Kremlin?
well, there is always a generation gap between generations, but I can't agree that that can explain what my distinguished counterparts in this discussion wanted to explain. About Magnitsky case, everything I know about this case makes me believe that if there was somebody interested in his death, it was not Russia at all, but the others. It's his chief, for whom he works, the head of Hermitage Capital, William Browder. His activity was beyond any legal standards of the time, etc. But let us return to the law, Magnitsky law in the Congress. They were removing the Jackson-Vanik amendment, and they wanted something to continue what they have been continuing all the time. And they chose this case. It was clearly political just choice to take one of these and accuse Russia that there are no human rights, there are no legal procedures, etc. And what I have heard here...
But why is the posthumous trial continuing? Do you agree with the fact that they're continuing to try him even though he's dead?
I truly believe sincerely that they want to find the truth about, especially after all the noise about his death. So, because it needs the investigation and the activity of his chief that certainly in America would earn, 25, 65 years in prison, etc. So why not?
Okay, one final point. One final point.
Few words about children. Yes, Americans were adopting, many of the Americans adopted handicapped children, but it's not true that Russian parents do not want to adopt handicapped. Because the majority of Russian parents, of course, these are childless parents, and they want to realize their unrealized parental feelings because they don't have. But a lot of big families adopt. And I believe that
just one
the adoption stimulated enormous work on the part of the society and government to improve the conditions of the orphan homes.
Okay, Natalia Narochnitskaya, thank you. Just one final question for George Frederick Jewsbury here. We've seen that the U.S. passing the Magnitsky law, a hardball approach to this. In Europe, a lot of wavering so far in terms of which way to go when it comes to Russia. Do you think Europe can adopt a common stance when it comes to Russia?
I wonder if Europe can adopt a common status on anything, frankly, especially with Russia, with the problems of natural gas and the rest.
Too much beholden.
Too exposed. And frankly, one of the former American ambassadors was quoted as saying that the Magnitsky Act was a mistake. Because in the long term, in this moral quest, it's going to block the financial transactions that will help.
All right, so we'll have to follow the money. George Frederick Jewsbury, I want to thank you. I also want to thank Sasha KOULAEVA, Douglas Herbert, and Natalia Narochnitskaya for joining us from Moscow. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.